I work overnights at a 24-hour diner. You can probably guess what company. I'm used to weird people and odd things happening, but tonight was just too much. The restaurant backs up to a field that has a tree line, and my cook and I would go out back to smoke sometimes. We could hear someone yelling in the distance tonight, but we get a lot of homeless people that come through town that are usually harmless, so we shrugged it off as sorta weird and went back inside. Later on, I came out again to smoke and throw away some trash in the dumpster that was next to the field. You might think it was stupid to go over to it, but I hadn't heard any sounds out there again. As I was walking away from the dumpster though, I suddenly heard someone call out to me. "Hey you, come here! Hey, come here!" It was clearly the same person, but much closer than when we had heard him yelling the first time. I went inside and got my coworker, who owned a car with a spotlight on it. We shined it out into the field, which again was not that smart, we'll admit that, but we couldn't see where this guy was. I could still hear him though. "Hey girl, come here!" I called the cops at this point. This was just too weird to be dealing with on my own. As soon as I got off the phone with them, a man came walking out of the field. He was an older man, wearing a tan trench coat. My coworker and a customer ran back inside because this dude was hauling ass across the parking lot. He started to come towards the door, and I called the cops again. My cook cut him off and told him he needed to go right now. The man was now acting incredibly erratically, running around and yelling at my cook. All of a sudden he stopped and said, "I'll end your life the next time I see you, you fucker." He kept moving his jacket by his waist like he was flashing a weapon or something, but we couldn't really see anything from inside. The cops caught him down the road. An officer came by and basically said the guy was homeless and not mentally stable. Wow, what a surprise. We told them everything that happened, and my cook tried to press charges on him for threatening him. The officers told us there wasn't anything they could do though. He wouldn't give her his name, so they just let him go. Basically, it all ended with, "Oh, by the way, he's known to carry a knife in his waistband. Call us if you need us. Bye." He came back, again hauling ass across the neighboring parking lot and back into the field. We could hear him screaming all the while, saying, "Hey, come here!" again and again. We got busy when the bar closed, and I hadn't heard him yelling ever since. I know he's still hiding back there though, because I occasionally catch glimpses of him or see him emerging from the field slightly. My manager comes in the morning, and I'm going to try and get her to let me take a picture of him off the security tapes so I can warn the other third shift workers. The field that he's camping out in also backs up to a middle school, but the cops said again there was nothing they could do. Hopefully he moves on and leaves us alone, or the cops can get him on something before anybody gets hurt. My sister and I were having a prank war for about a week straight. Well, we agreed to a ceasefire since my birthday was only 2 days away. I had just turned 11, and later that very same night, I began to hear my closet door open. Oh, so my sister wanted to prank me on my special day, eh? I'll show her, I thought. I knew she must have snuck in and forgot that my door squeaks, so I had an idea. I would get up and push her. I'm a genius, kiddo. Slowly I got up, and she began to step out of the closet, only for me to realize this was not my sister. My sister didn't have long black hair or scars on her face, and wasn't as tall as a grown woman either. I went to scream, but instead I just froze and silently started whimpering and crying. The woman knelt down to me and brushed my hair out of my face, then put her finger to her lips and let out a soft shh. She then opened my window and crawled outside, slowly closed it, and was never seen again. At first, I thought the woman was a ghost or something. But after telling my parents, I became convinced that someone snuck into my room through my window that night. This story happened about a year and a half ago now, when I was around 19 years old. It will always stay with me, as it's definitely given me PTSD and a great fear of men since it happened. I had just moved into a college apartment with friends, only finding out a few months later that there was improper ventilation. That led to excess humidity and mold in the bathrooms and other spaces. Maintenance and management would proceed to label it as discoloration and say to just leave the windows open or buy a fan and stop taking steamy showers. This advice was given after this event, and ignoring my reports I made to law enforcement and the main landlord. However, we were barely adults and had never had to deal with such a terrible mold issue. Buying sprays, cleaning the ceilings and all crevices, the corners of the tub, constantly in fear of mold inhalation. We found this cleaning regimen and leaving our window open with the mosquito screen locked helped the most to air out the place. This small window, about the size of an average human head and about 9 feet off the ground, was no concern to us when we were using the bathroom. After all, we'd even walked around outside and checked ourselves to make sure no one could easily look or get in. Of course, I never could have predicted what would come next. On our front porch, we had some pumpkins and a single white chair that was barely used. This will become important later. One night, after airing out the humid bathroom after a shower like normal, I wished my roommate good night around 2 a.m. before going to use the toilet. I was wearing the baggiest shirt ever at the time, so thankfully nothing was exposed while doing so. I nonchalantly flushed and went to wash my hands when I happened to glance to the left, where the window was ajar as usual, and that's when I saw it. In the pitch black of night, in contrast to the blaring and cheap bathroom lights, there was a pale round orb with a mop of dark hair atop it, obviously someone's head. I can't explain to you the feeling I had in that moment. It was almost like when someone is whispering to you just audibly enough to where you need a second or two to register what they're actually saying. After that pause, I did a double take, only to see a white arm now leaning into the mosquito screen for support, before whisking away and down out of frame. Without another thought, I found myself running for the front door, screaming. Someone was looking into the bathroom! I was yelling over and over to my roommate in the living area. On a side note, do not ever chase after a perp, no matter what the cause is, even if it's hard with adrenaline running through you in those cases. I heard her yelling back, while I found myself already at the bottom of the window outside. I could hear scuffling through the wood chips outside our apartment building. It was clearly the sound of someone swiftly escaping. There was no mistaking it. I couldn't see anyone through the shitty trees that were planted all around though, and stopped, as I couldn't pinpoint exactly where he'd gone to. I thought about yelling some cheap insult or threat to scare him, but I found myself feeling waves of shock silence me. I ran past my roommate, grabbed my phone from inside, and called my mother, who advised me to call the non-emergency number in my town. I did so while sitting on the patio with my self-defense items and my roommate. The lady that answered was clearly annoyed and sounded like she didn't even believe me, no matter what I said, all because I didn't get a good look at him. She sighed, then said the police would be over to survey the complex shortly, then hung up on me. My roommate and I were in shock, just sitting there in silence. We discussed in detail what just happened when we saw a cop car driving around the complex 1 block away. They immediately drove off after 1 minute of lingering. Obviously, this left me feeling a bit more defeated than before. I got angry, stood up, and examined the area outside my window myself. I saw no footprints or markings that were unnatural. I even tried standing on the electric boxes outside to see if I could get a look like the guy was. Not only were the boxes too narrow for someone any bigger than myself, as I have a small shoe size compared to the average guy, but this would only allow for a view of half the ceiling for a second or two before falling off altogether. Obviously, that's not how he was looking in. I knew from the way he had struggled to get down. I saw enough of his torso to determine he must be around 5'8", and had to have some other way to be easily staring in like that. It was also odd that he had somehow managed to dart off without me actually seeing him, and only really hearing him, because there are sensors placed all around the complex, and one right outside our bathroom window. When triggered, they display a bright and blinding light that lights up the whole back area inside of our apartment where this occurred. I brainstormed for a second before trying to trigger it. It didn't go off. When I walked back to my roommate, that's when it did. I tested this twice over, and the same results. It only worked if you were moving slowly past it. Oddly enough, I felt a sense of relief. If only for the fact that I was clearly not crazy. I was the only witness to this, but I could tell my roommate believed me. We headed back to our front door, talking about what we would do if the guy came back. Obviously, we would be keeping our window closed now, but we had to give him just desserts somehow, we thought in our exhausted and overwhelmed teenage heads. And that was when I joked about grabbing one of our pumpkins and smacking him over the head with it, when I stopped in my tracks. "Hey, didn't we have a chair there?" I asked. The white patio chair was gone. We looked around and it was nowhere to be found. That was how we did it. My roommate hurriedly looked through her phone. She remembered having a food order earlier that day, with photo confirmation. Approximately 4 hours earlier, there it was, the bag at our door sitting directly on the white chair next to our pumpkins. I immediately posted to social media sites, asking for help finding this distinct chair. Maybe that would help us track down this pale-faced creep. Not only had he been staring into our bathroom for God knows how long, but he had surveyed our front door area and possibly looked into the windows there as well. Our apartment made sure to install the worst kinds of blinds you can never fully close, so if anyone wanted to look inside, all they would have to do was crouch a bit. We felt disgusted and shocked. I left 3 voice messages with the apartment complex the next day, informing them of the incident and the issues with our ventilation. As you can expect, no one ever got back to me, which was weird since they always did previously. I did everything I could, but we couldn't really do anything. In fact, I received tips from other college girls in the same area, telling me of very similar experiences. Recently, these past few months too, there have been numerous sexual assaults, as well as peeping toms, in the area of our apartments. Funnily enough, their more clear descriptions matched the brief glimpse I got of the man. Still, the police never caught anyone in connection with all these cases. I never viewed this area as a bad area, and always took every precaution I could. I still feel a bit at fault now, though. I know I'm not, but I hope everyone living in a similar situation makes sure to at least close their shower curtains to shield yourself, or close your window when the bathroom is in use at all. I wish I could afford to buy security cameras, but I know the management would file a complaint against me. I'm moving out soon, so that's really the only solace I have, getting out of there and leaving all this behind. I used to love a good Subway sandwich. I still do, kind of, but I don't get it as often as I used to, due to the rising prices. My go-to was always a 6-inch untoasted Italian sub with turkey, provolone cheese, pepperoni, pickles, black olives, and salt and pepper. I changed it to a foot-long when I got older. I never deviated from that formula for as long as I went to the local Subway in my town. That is, until one day. Probably my last day going there for quite a while. I like to joke that it might have been a sign, but I really don't know what to believe. It was a normal Saturday afternoon. My boyfriend and I went to grab some lunch after a date at the pet store right next door. We like to stop by and look at all the reptiles specifically, and fantasize about which ones we'd get when we got our own place. Not that that's the point of this story or anything. The subway wasn't all that busy. Just us, the 2 employees, and 2 people sitting in a booth in the back corner. We were able to jump right in line. I let my boyfriend go first, and was just about to order my usual, when one of the other pre-established combinations caught my eye, a steak and cheese. I decided to take a chance and try it. After we paid, we went to sit down with our meal. It smelled amazing to me. My boyfriend and I were quickly lost in our conversation and our food. So much so that even the restaurant chatter faded away into the background. At one point though, I looked over and noticed the 2 people at the other occupied booth had both drawn their hoods over their faces and were in the middle of an intense and whispered conversation. I was facing them, while my boyfriend had his back to them. While I don't normally eavesdrop on people, something about the way they were talking and glancing back at the counter kept getting my attention. My boyfriend asked what was wrong, but I said it was nothing. Suddenly, the man of the 2 turned and made eye contact with me. His eyes widened, and he turned to his partner. They got up from their seats in a hurry and rushed out the door. As they did so, something clattered to the floor, something the guy must have dropped. It hit the ground with a loud smack. My boyfriend went over to see what it was. It turned out to be a knife, a pretty big one at that. We immediately took it to the front counter and explained what we'd seen. The girl we talked to looked creeped out to say the least, and said she wasn't sure what to think. We've speculated that the 2 people were gathering courage to rob the place. When the guy saw me looking at him, he must have assumed we knew what they were up to, and decided to get out of there instead. We're really glad nobody got hurt, but we haven't been back to that Subway shop ever since. I'm young. I'm 30, so I'm kind of young. But I saw this little girl at Walmart not too long ago, just running around in the toy aisles enjoying herself. She must have run past me 4 or 5 times. I smiled a bit, thinking about how endearing it was, but as I paid closer attention, I noticed that a man would always be right behind her, or right on her tail. For some reason, I could feel something was off here. I stopped the little girl from her frantic running and asked her if she was lost perhaps. She said yes. I asked if the man was her daddy, and with almost tears in her eyes, she looked back at him and slowly looked back at me. Then she said she didn't know him at all. I grabbed her by the hand and told her we were going to go to the front and have them call for her mommy. The man was just standing there in the aisle. I grabbed her a little harder as we walked past him and made our way to the front of the store. As we walked right past the man, I looked him straight in the eye. He just kinda gave me this smirk that today still raises the hair on my body remembering it. Had I not stopped that little girl and brought her to the front to find her mom, I'm genuinely scared to know what that guy would have done to her. Before I begin, here's a little background on me when this happened. I was about 5 feet tall and had quite a broad figure, due to me playing rugby quite a lot. A little background on Lucas when this happened. He was about 5'5" and very slim. Anyway, here's the story. In high school, there was this guy who I found extremely attractive and cute. I'll call him Lucas. At the time, I was 16. He was in a few of my classes, maybe 3 or 4. I'd always want to talk to him and get to know him, but with me being in the closet, the massive fear of rejection, and not knowing whether he was gay or not, I decided to just admire him from afar, rather than try to pursue him. As time went by throughout the term though, I started to notice him staring at me more and more. In the classes we had together, At first, I was happy he'd even noticed me at all, to be honest, but it started to make me a bit uncomfortable and self-conscious. I pretended not to notice, since it would have been embarrassing for both of us if we made eye contact during him staring. Half-term came around, and I wasn't thinking much about Lucas at this point. We came back to school, and in our psychology class, we were paired up for group activities. We sat down next to each other. I didn't really know how to feel about this. We didn't talk for the first few lessons. But when a group activity and case study practicing came around, it was a must to do so. I started the talking, and he reacted normally. Being close to him was making my heart pound like crazy. He was exactly my type. A few lessons passed by of us conversing normally about many things, including the schoolwork. When he out of the blue asked for my number, I was pretty much in shock. I asked for what reason. He replied he was just curious. Of course, I gave it to him. By this point, I'd completely forgotten about the strange staring from when he used to sit far away from me. As soon as the school hour ended, he began to text me, asking me how I was. The only thing I found somewhat strange was how immediate all his replies were, even if mine were a few minutes late. Lucas didn't have Facebook or anything on social media, and whenever I saw him around school, he was all alone reading older books. I began to raise my courage within me to ask if he was gay or not, considering the interest he was showing in me. I waited for a good opportunity to ask. After I sent that text, it was about 2 minutes before I got a response. I noticed this because the latest of all his other replies were only about 10 seconds in between. No exaggeration. His reply was, "Yes, does that bother you?" I decided to tell him I was too in the heat of the moment. I was truly happy that he was willing to be open about it with me, and I thought I should do the same. He replied with, "Oh, cool." This is where things took a turn. He began to send like 5 or 6 messages in a row. They would devolve into asking where I was or whether I wanted him to go away if I didn't reply immediately. After I replied, he would go right back to being sweet and friendly. Halftime came around once again, and I was ready to start hitting the parties. One night, I left for the party with my phone, but I realized I'd forgotten to plug it into the charger, so it was pretty much dead. I didn't realize this until the car ride to the place. I forgot about it and drank until I became tipsy. The party was a lot of fun. It finished up, and I started to walk home with some good friends for part of the journey. They had to go their own way though, and I had to follow a path through some small woods. I didn't even think about being scared, since I'd done it a million times before, even during the night. Less than halfway across the path though, I began to hear someone whispering from a bush right beside where I needed to walk. I felt my heart clench. I tried not to react much, because I didn't want them to realize I was there. The whispering was repetitive, and getting louder and louder. I was contemplating what to do. Should I turn back or try to get past without this guy noticing me? I had to make a split-second decision. I thought it would have been dumb to walk all this way and just turn back over some probably homeless and harmless man. I still attempted to walk by without them hearing me. As I was walking though, the whispering stopped and the leaves began to rustle as if someone was moving slowly around in the brush. I should have known to begin running at that point, but I was frozen in fear of the unknown. I had no idea who was hiding there. It was all too clear to me that whoever it was had noticed me. I remember the overwhelming feeling of hesitation to run, that it would cause them to lunge at me and chase after. I waited for about 10 seconds after the rustling. As I stood there, a black figure rose slowly from the bushes, wearing a black hoodie, with the hood covering the moonlight from reaching their face. They had quite a short and slim build. I didn't think there would have been a problem taking them on, but they lifted their arm, revealing a kitchen knife covered in red liquid that seemed to be blood. The mere sight of this sent me into a panic. I began to sprint straight home. I looked back and saw the figure standing out in the middle of the path. Where they were stood, I could see their whole figure. When I reached home, I didn't even take a second to breathe. I woke my parents up and told them what happened. My dad called the police, while I looked through the blinds in our kitchen discreetly to see if anyone was out there. The next morning, we were told nothing was found, but they would look into it more. I checked my phone since I'd been away from it for a while. I had over 200 missed messages from Lucas, exclaiming that if he couldn't have me, then no one could. He went on to say how he knew my route home, and he'd been waiting to show me how much he was devoted to me. I was freaking out, and decided to show these messages to my parents. They gave the information to the police. The first day back to school, I noticed he wasn't in any of his classes. That happened for the next few weeks, and no one seemed to really notice. He didn't have any friends, really. I never asked my parents what happened to him, since I was at a very difficult time. The messages were how they found out I was gay, so I didn't like to talk much about it. After asking the teachers if they knew anything, I noticed they'd all become clammy when the situation was discussed and avoided answering at all costs. I decided to just not ask anymore eventually. It seemed to make everyone uncomfortable, and to be honest, I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what happened to him. I'll never know whose blood was on that knife, or whether it was even blood at all, really. I assume it must have been his own. I'm now 20 and in college. To me, it's now a distant memory. I know this might not be as bad as some stories you've heard, but to me, it was a truly terrifying part of my life. I guess you could say I'm lucky in life. I'm attractive, a young woman with long flowing blonde hair, and voluptuous for my age. In other ways, I'm unlucky though. Let me tell you how this all started. When I was a senior in a New Jersey high school, a creepy and thin kid named Gary enrolled there. Even though Gary was super thin and acted creepy and awkward, he was surprisingly strong and beat to a pulp some bullies who'd mistakenly thought he was weak. Unfortunately for me, Gary was in my gym class, and he became infatuated with me. I remember in gym, the boys all wear t-shirts and shorts, and the girls wore t-shirts and shorts as well. Being in gym class sometimes, though, I would wear spandex tights with my sneakers. That was a bad idea, apparently. This led Gary to become even more attracted to me. I remember one day I was running around the track at gym when Gary just ran up to me and said, "Jamie, would you like to go out with me?" He had this leering grin on his face. I politely declined him. "I'm sorry, Gary, you're just not my type." I tried to say it as sweetly as possible, but it didn't go over very well. Gary grabbed my arm so hard it left a bruise. "You will go out with me," he yelled at me angrily. This behavior from him frightened me, obviously. One of my girlfriends ran up to us and then whisked me out of Gary's hands. "Come on, Gary, leave her alone, you heard what she said." We quickly walked away. Looking back on all this now, I probably should have called the gym teacher, the school principal, or maybe even my dad for help, but I just didn't for some reason. I guess I was probably afraid that Gary might hurt me for doing so. Later in health class, Gary slid in right next to me and started to rub his hand down my leg. I quickly brushed his hand off my lap, only for Gary to then creepily look at our teacher. "You know, Miss Perilla is not nearly as built as you are," he said, adding in a Joker maniac laugh for some added flair. He tried to lay his hands on my legs again. I brushed it off once more. Great. Now I had a sick, perverted guy harassing me in class. Plus, I found out Gary's father was a police detective. A police detective with a sick, perverted son, stalking the hell out of me. That stalking did not cease at just the classroom either. Things started to happen outside of school as well. Later one night, my girlfriend Donna and I took a bus to a movie we wanted to see. When we got off the bus, we noticed that Gary had followed us sneakily in his car. Donna and I paid for our movie tickets and rushed into our particular movie, hoping Gary didn't see which theater we went to. As luck would have it, he did. He sat down right next to me. "Wow, Jamie, you sure are one sexy young girl. Are you sure you don't want to go out with me?" he asked me for the millionth time. I just grabbed Donna's hand and rushed past him as we left the theater. And there was one time my friends and I were walking down the sidewalk together, and Gary literally jumped out of a bush and grabbed me. I'd never been so scared in all my life. I screamed and somehow managed to get out of his grasp. I ran away with my friends. It was lucky for me Gary didn't seem to know where I lived or my cell phone number. If he did, he would have always been hounding me with calls and things like that. One of the last times Gary bothered me was when I was walking down the hallway in school. Gary grabbed my butt quite hard, making me drop my school books all over the floor. "Are you absolutely sure you don't want to date me?" he asked, leering at me with a wide and evil grin on his face. I picked up my books and started walking to class. He walked away doing this crazy hysterical laugh. Fortunately for me, I was a senior in high school and was going to graduate soon. I did happily and enrolled in an out-of-state college. Although I was happy, the fear of Gary never left my mind. I was hoping I would never meet the guy again, but life is never certain. Late one night, my cell phone buzzed in my college room. I woke up in bed with a startled fright. I don't usually get calls this late, even though I do have my phone on in case of emergencies. It was a female friend from my hometown. She told me that Gary was at the center of a court case, and he'd just been found guilty of murdering his then-girlfriend. He was sentenced to life in prison, although he apparently ended up hanging himself in the prison cell. I did feel bad for Gary's parents, but to be honest, I felt no sympathy for Gary himself. He had harassed me throughout high school. He even killed someone. As I said before, life is very uncertain, but as terrible as it sounds, I'm glad Gary will never bother me or anyone ever again. I grew up dirt poor in western South Dakota. The county I lived in was larger than Delaware, with a population of about 30,000 people. When I was bored, which was quite frequently, I'd go to the library in town, population 530. I'd pick a random book and start reading. One of the books I read was a history of the area, and one of the stories dealt with my stepfather's father's property. In that, his father had annexed some property in the 30s during the Dust Bowl. My grandmother was kind of well off, but easily the most evil person I've ever met. Curious, I asked her about my late step-great-grandfather's annexation about a week or two later. The Millers was how she answered. No other explanation. It took me asking aunts and uncles, but the story went that during one of the particularly horrid dust storms, a family called the Millers had abandoned their property, just left the place and went to greener pastures in California. I asked around where this supposed property used to be. They mentioned it was on the southeast side, by some mini badlands areas we called the Breaks. When I asked if the house and everything was still there, they said no, and that it was a waste of time. I was a curious little shit though, and my favorite topics were history and archaeology. So, one afternoon, I went to where I thought they were talking about. A bit of a rise in the middle of otherwise completely uninteresting plains. There was nothing there. A couple of more weeks went by. I was probably 12 or 11, I forget exactly. I went on a ride down that way again, dirt bike. I found myself in a sort of V between some breaks when I saw what I thought was a weird pyramid of some sort. I went to go check it out. What it actually ended up being was the angle of a roof sticking out of the ground. I went around to the far side of it and saw an attic vent. Being more curious than cautious, I pulled the framing around the vent and opened it up. There was a bunch of dirt blown around, but otherwise the area was mostly intact. Nothing much to it really. It was an unfinished attic with one of those old school ladders halfway down and a couple of holes going down to the rooms underneath. I glanced down into one. When my eyes adjusted to the light, I'm fairly sure I saw someone down there lying on the floor. I can't tell you who they were though, because I was out of there so fucking fast, I outran the photons in the air. I rode back to Grandma's house, but there was no way on the planet I was telling that woman I'd gone there. I waited for a week and told my cousin Brad instead. Brad was and is slightly more intelligent than a piece of driftwood. He called BS and wanted to see himself. I was having none of this, but told him I'd take him there anyway. I wasn't going to be a chicken. When I got to where I had been before, where I damn well know I was, there wasn't a house or a roof either. You could see my dirt bike tracks and footprints all around, but it looked like I'd just walked around nothing for a while in the alkali dirt. Brad gave me a bunch of crap about it. Went down and told my other cousins I'd tried to fool him. Even a couple of my aunts found out and gave me shit for it too. I swear it happened though. There's been a whole lot in my life I may have embellished to make more interesting, but this happened just the way I typed it, and it still messes with me to this very day. Let me give you some background on the situation. My name is John, and I was 16 at the time of this event, in the middle of my junior year. I'm of Asian descent and I'm nearsighted as well, which means I can't see very far away. No more than a couple inches away from my face, really. It all started when I was in my homeroom. I'll call my teacher Mrs. H. Now, Mrs. H was a young woman in her 30s, but looked much older than she was. She taught history and I have her second period. First period had just ended, and I was just getting into class. As I was walking over to my seat, I saw a skinny black-haired kid sitting there already. "Are you the new kid?" I asked. "Yeah, name's Kyle." "Cool, my name's John." "I don't want to be rude, but you're in my seat right now. Could you please move over?" He gave me the face a child would make when you don't give them what they want. He sat up and sat in the seat right behind me. He reeked like someone who hadn't had a shower in quite a long time. I took a seat and the class began. Mrs. H explained that there was a project we had to do on famous landmarks. This was a partner project. Lucky me, I was paired with Kyle. I thought not only was this going to get me a bad grade, but it meant he had to come over to my house too, or I had to go over to his. Obviously, I did not want someone coming over to my house. I didn't wish to go anywhere else really for that matter, so I made a stupid decision and decided to give Kyle my phone number instead. Everything was alright for the first couple of days. Nothing really weird beside that look he'd given me a couple of days ago, except for one afternoon, where me and him had just finished up writing. We'd both done 2 pages each, and were going to pick out the highlights from both of them and combine them together. That was a couple of hours ago. My parents were now out at dinner, and I was home alone playing some computer games. That was when I heard what sounded like glass shattering from the basement, which was quite odd because I was on the 2nd floor. Being the coward I am, I decided to pause my game and just listen, not sure what to expect. I sat there listening for a good 5 minutes before resuming my game playing. Another minute went by, and I could hear the door to the basement opening. I don't have any pets beside the cat, which was on my bed at the time. I left my computer and turned off the monitor, grabbing my phone to dial 911. This was on a landline installed to my room, which was my dad's office for some time. I quickly told the operator the situation, and she dispatched an officer. I could hear quiet footsteps moving up the stairs. It felt like forever, but was really only 3 minutes or so when I heard the sirens approaching. I'd never felt so safe in my life. That was until my door slammed open. I couldn't see much, only a mere silhouette of a figure. The sirens passed by my window and shone enough light for me to see the face of Kyle. He didn't seem to notice me there. He hid in the closet parallel to me. I'd never been so scared in my entire life. His facial expression was the same from when I told him to move out of my seat. In roughly 30 seconds of utter darkness, besides some streetlights glaring in through the window, the door slammed open. A cop rushed in and turned on the light. He asked me if I was okay. I screamed my lungs out, trying to explain that he was hiding in the closet, all the while sobbing. The officer opened the closet, and Kyle attacked him immediately. Luckily, he managed to tase Kyle. I asked the cops why they'd arrived so fast when it normally takes them much longer to get there. He told me the operator had heard another phone line click after I hung up. I handed in the project a week later because I took some time off from school. I stayed at my grandparents' house for a while. Luckily, I got an A, so I never had to meet Kyle again. By the way, I recently noticed that my Facebook has my phone number and address on it. Needless to say, that's probably how he got my address. Without a doubt, I took both off and set my profile to private. If you have a Facebook as well, I advise you strongly to do the same. Working from home during the 2020 pandemic was a real blessing. No getting up 2 hours early for a commute. No standing next to zombified angry strangers on the train platform. No being smothered once you're actually inside. No rushing, and most importantly, no late-night train commutes to get back home when you're already exhausted and just want to curl up on the couch with your cat and avoid thinking about life for a while. At least, that was my experience. Unfortunately, all blessings must eventually come to an end, I guess. I work at a marketing office in the heart of New York City, and corporate wanted all available employees to come back to the office as soon as possible. Pretty much immediately once the necessary mandates had all been lifted, which meant all the things I hated would be coming right back, and my cat would be quite lonely to boot. I considered quitting after a lot of soul-searching during the break, but fuck it. I still needed the money for my apartment and a little fluffball living with me. I reluctantly prepared for my first morning commute in many months. It was just as terrible as I remembered, but this time it was also full of other people who also hated a sudden return to the office. The usual assholes shoving their way around the train were multiplied by 10. I just tried to shuffle along with the crowd and get to work unscathed. The work itself wasn't too bad, about the same as doing it from home, with the exception of the boss asking a few of us to work overtime tonight. It was something I could refuse from the comfort of my own home, but his expectant smile said he'd make sure I wouldn't be invited to the company happy hour at the end of the month if I didn't do it. It was a grin as fake as sugar-free syrup. Needless to say, I agreed. I didn't get out until at least 10 at night, meaning the sky was quite dark, and I could see my breath in the open air. I hustled to the subway station a block away from my office building and scuttled gratefully down the stairs. It wasn't much warmer than the above ground, but at least it did provide some shelter from the shearing cold. The platform itself was nearly empty, except for a few stragglers like me waiting patiently on the outskirts of the platform. I guess that's one blessing in getting out this late. The train wouldn't be very crowded. When you try not to make eye contact with people waiting for the train, you go into a kind of autopilot trance. I was just thinking about whether my cat at home would be mad about getting his dinner late when I felt someone bump into my shoulder. I kind of absent-mindedly stared into space for a solid minute before breaking out of my trance and turning to face the person who'd bumped into me. I expected an apology or someone talking on their phone oblivious, maybe even an angry huff as they walked past. You know, something normal. Instead, what greeted me was a man half an inch from my face, looking straight into my eyes with the biggest fucking grin I'd ever seen. I almost came out with an "Oh, Jesus Christ," but I caught myself at the last minute. I'm sure the man could see the shock on my face though. In fact, he seemed to be kind of enjoying it, because he blinked and his grin became even wider, if that was possible. "Do you need something?" I asked him, hoping he'd tell me what he wanted and just fuck off, but instead he kept staring. "Whatever," I said to no one, and promptly moved to the other end of the platform. No luck though. This creepy guy followed me, doing a kind of weird side shuffle like you might see in a Looney Tunes cartoon. He bumped up against me again. I had to wonder at this point if he needed help or if he was on drugs or something. "Hey buddy," I tried again, putting my hands up. "I'll call someone for you if you need it, but stop following me." My voice kind of wavered, and I hated myself for that. This time he actually answered me in a surprisingly raspy voice. "Tell me where you live." What the fuck? No! I lost all politeness at this point. This was getting really creepy. I couldn't wait for that train to come already. Thankfully it did. The train pulled to a screeching stop, and I was never more grateful to see it than that moment. I bolted to the open doors without looking back at the smiler to see if he was following me. Maybe a potential mistake on my part, but I didn't really care. I immediately hunkered down into a seat. I watched the passengers getting on after me and scanned the aisles as best I could. I was hoping he didn't or hadn't already gotten on through another door. It looked like I was lucky, but just to make sure, I turned to look out the window towards the platform. He was still out there smiling. He waved at me as the train started to move. The last image I saw of him was when he turned and walked away, probably to go bother someone else. I didn't know what he wanted, but I have an inkling that it probably was not good. And for those of you wondering, yes, my cat did get his dinner. The things I put up with for that little guy. In 2010, I was driving from New Orleans to Eugene, Oregon. It was just me, 24 and female, and my 2-year-old pit bull in a 14-foot U-Haul truck with everything I owned crammed into the back. I had a fancy flip phone and my printout MapQuest directions as well. I think the first smartphones were actually coming out around that time, but I didn't have one. Cell phone service was also much spottier, and there were long stretches through the desert where you had zero service for hundreds of miles. I was driving a lonely stretch of highway through central Texas when I realized I hadn't seen a town or an exit for a very long time, and my giant U-Haul was really low on the gas. Just when I was starting to freak out and seriously run out, I saw a small town coming up ahead. I pulled into this town, and it was really tiny. I was so worried about other things at the time that I never paid attention to the name of the town, but there were only about 6 streets in the entire place. I go gas up, and I'm ready to get back on the road, except for the life of me, I couldn't find my way back to the highway. I circled the town about 4 times, and started getting really frustrated. This was such a tiny town. How could I not find my way out of here? I could literally see the highway, but I just couldn't get to it. I returned to the gas station to ask for directions. Now, when I got the gas initially, I paid at the pump and never went inside. When I entered for directions, there was a skinny nondescript guy who had black hair hanging down in front of his eyes that looked like it could use a good wash. He was not particularly creepy, but he was a little bit rude. He never really met my eyes. He was just looking down at a magazine. He gave me directions which didn't sound right at all. He was telling me to take a road that would get me to the highway in 17 miles. For a moment, I was dumbfounded. Then I pointed out that I hadn't had to drive that far to get from the highway into town, so why was it so far to get back to it? I could literally see it from the town. He was so casual, almost like I was just an annoyance. I could follow his directions or not. Why should he care? He gave me some explanation about the road curving around that didn't really make sense. He still wouldn't look at me either. Just whatever, I gave you your directions, and waved his hand in the direction of the door. When I got to the parking lot, my whole body started trembling violently, and my heart started racing, seemingly for no reason. I got into the truck, and as soon as I put the key in the ignition, I burst into tears. I had the most terrible feeling that no matter how nonchalant he acted, the man had bad intentions. I didn't know what exactly they were, but I knew right then and there was no way I was going to follow these directions. Yet this was the only store in this little town, and short of knocking on everyone's doors, there was no one else to ask. I decided I didn't give a shit if this town seemed like something that dropped right out of the Twilight Zone. I was going to drive around until I found my way out, even if it took all damn night. Like then, a big red beater of a pickup truck, just as much rust as metal, pulled up and disgorged the quintessential Texan man. Huge, husky, and in flannel and work boots. Without even thinking about it, I jumped out of my truck and approached him quickly, yet warily. Looking into his eyes, though, I saw a kind human being, or at least I was hoping I did. I asked him if he could please give me directions back to the highway. I told him I knew it was silly, but I just couldn't seem to find my way back. He looked concerned as I was visibly upset, so he made me laugh and very cheerfully gave me directions for a hairpin curved turnoff right at the end of a small concrete tunnel I had passed by several times. He said it often confused travelers because it was so hard to see, and that they really needed to put up some signs. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I asked him how far in miles it was back to the highway. He laughed and gave me a funny look. "Miles, miss? I'd say it's a quarter mile at most. You can see the highway from right there." At this point, I couldn't help it. I had to know. "What happens if I drive here?" I gave him the directions the man in the store had given me. Old Texas looked at me very intently and asked me how I knew about this particular route. It was pretty far out, and usually only locals knew about it, so I told him. He was quiet for a few minutes, then asked what the attendant looked like and if I had a map of the state. Nope, just my MapQuest, which wasn't useful in this situation. He went back to his truck and grabbed a raggedy local map from his glove box. Spreading it out for me, he retraced the route I described. The way the man from the gas station had told me to go led away from town, away from the interstate, and seemingly to the middle of nowhere. Texas told me the road did go about 17 miles, right before it dead-ended in the middle of the desert. I asked him what was out there. He told me it was nothing but some junk cars and a few trailers and mobile homes, all owned by the same family. The family was known locally as troublemakers, meth heads, and alcoholics. These were the nice things townspeople had to say about them. The erstwhile clerk was a part of this family that lived down that road. I'll never forget the look in Texas's eyes as he told me this. He also told me I was smart to listen to my instincts and told me to be careful when traveling out there. I don't know if the man from the gas station wanted what was in the back of my U-Haul or what was in the driver's seat, but thankfully I didn't have to find out. I also learned that sometimes angels look like ruddy-haired Texans with scruffy faces and rusty old pickups. Thank you, random Texan stranger. You really saved my ass, and I'll always remember you with tons of love. I used to work at a small subway located in a huge indoor fast food conglomerate plaza that functioned as a rest stop for buses on the highway passing through Connecticut. How it works is that each fast food joint has its own little cubicle inside a large circular building. Honestly, kind of like a mall food court, except it smells more like gasoline than your typical mall would. I saw all kinds of passerby on my shifts, some just in a rush to catch their bus before it left, and others coming into the station from their cars with all the time in the world, all relatively normal. I'd just make their sandwiches as the faces slipped by, one blending into the rest as I waited for the long night shift to end. The only way some stood out to me on the longer nights was if they had cool makeup, an unusual hairstyle, or were exceptionally patient or nice to my frazzled self. One night though, one of the bust customers stood out to me for all the wrong reasons. It was much busier than usual this night, and all across the food court, lines were nearly merging into one another, like a huge net made of people. I was doing my best to get all these sandwiches out before the buses left, when suddenly a young woman appeared at the head of my line. She was skinny, pale, and disheveled, and looked as if she didn't know where she was. I couldn't tell if she was in her right mind or extremely tired, so I decided to rush to get her on her way. That was until she whispered in a quiet and timid voice, "What state are we in?" I didn't know what to say to that. She didn't elaborate any further, so maybe she'd just fallen asleep on her bus and needed someone to tell her where she'd ended up. We're in Connecticut, ma'am," I said. I thought she'd feel better, but she got this wide look in her eyes. "Wait, I was in New York." Her words began to slur. I was afraid she'd stumble and fall when a man slid into line behind her, grabbing her arm. "There you are," he said brightly. "I've been looking for you." He looked from the half-made sandwich in my hands to her, then my probably confused expression. His voice became a little quieter, and he leaned in. "I'll pay you for anything she got." Okay, sir," I said hesitantly, bagging up the sandwich and bringing it to the register. The man ushered the young woman along. I noticed that she seemed very jumpy whenever he touched her, still a little loopy as well, and definitely a lot more jittery. She kept making eye contact with me, but didn't seem to be able to form the expressions she wanted to. Weirded out, I got them all paid for and sent them on their way. I took my phone out of my pocket though, and held it under the desk as they went. When the man wasn't looking, I raised it and snapped a couple of pictures. My gut told me that was the best course of action. Something didn't feel right here. Maybe that woman needed some help. Maybe she was drugged or mentally ill. An even sicker thought entered my mind. Had I just let a human trafficker get away with his victim? I immediately thought back to a safety video we were all shown when the rest stop hired me on. How to spot trafficking victims, and she hit nearly every box. I immediately alerted my manager to the situation, and he called the authorities just as I saw them slipping out the door. I didn't want to cause a scene if I'd been wrong, but I also couldn't just let them go with a good conscience. The police arrived soon after, and luckily pulled over the bus as they were leaving just a mile or two down the highway. The woman was delirious and could hardly speak for herself. The man was extremely cagey. They took him into the station for more questioning and took her to the hospital. Needless to say, they found a cocktail of drugs in her system, and her levels indicated she'd last been dosed soon after she came off my line. He'd probably hidden something in the sandwich she got, which I still feel guilty for just making when the woman was clearly in trouble. I told the authorities everything I could about the man, how domineering he was with her, how scared the woman seemed, how she mentioned New York, and how she didn't seem to know him at all. Turns out she was indeed from New York and had been trafficked all the way to my bus stop for sex. I really hope she recovers soon. I still work at that bus stop in the same subway station, but nowadays, I pay a lot more attention to the customers that come in. You never know when your timely intervention might just help to save someone. So my stepsons are 7 and 10. They play with 5 other boys in our area who are of similar age and all go to the same school in our neighborhood. Now, there's a police station in our neighborhood, and we live in a city that's large. We feel very safe here. There's almost zero crime in this area, so when they want to go to the park or play with their friends, the husband and I agreed that it's okay. They'll often be gone for hours, going from house to house, swimming, jumping on trampolines, scootering, and skateboarding. Sometimes they all come to my house for my pool. It's a good system. I'm texting with other parents as well, so we have a pretty safe thing going. Our state, however, has been known for human trafficking because we're close enough to the border. It's something to worry about. I bought both of them bright orange rear whistles and tied them to their backpacks. Sometimes they all ride bikes to school together. At home, I had them practice blowing into the whistle as hard as they could, so they knew how loud it was and to only use it for emergencies. We also discussed which situations constitute an emergency. Today, on break from school, the kids wanted to do a lemonade stand. Something in my gut told me to say that was not a good idea, even though they had their own little garage sale around Christmas to make money, to buy gifts for everyone. The neighborhood thought it was cute too, and they actually got a ton of donations and made some good money. I didn't have any worries that time. Today was a different feeling though, for whatever reason. As my older stepson was making his signs, I reminded him about interacting with strangers and told him he needed to watch his brother closely. He asked me if he should bring his whistle, and I said that was a great idea. I took it off his backpack and put it around his neck and told him I was going to leave the window open just in case. If they felt scared for any reason, or if something happened, blow the whistle like there was no tomorrow, and I'd run outside. They were right on our street corner of our neighborhood, right where the main street went through, so there were a decent amount of cars going by. An hour or so had gone by, and I was well into a documentary when I heard that whistle blowing as hard as it could. My stomach dropped, and I dashed outside. I saw a flashy red car by them, like a Charger, I believe. I was looking and running towards the kids, so I wasn't paying close enough attention to the car. I could immediately see all the kids were still accounted for, but I could also see a man running to get back into his car. My older son told me our younger son, who really liked cars as does his dad, had been approached by the man in the car. He got out and started talking to them, asking them their ages, and invited my younger son to get into his car since he liked cars so much. I'd literally told my older son earlier, don't get into anyone's cars for any reason. When the man said that, he didn't feel safe anymore, so he blew the whistle as hard as he could. I got a good look at the guy at least, but I didn't get his plates. He was getting into his car as I was making sure the kids were accounted for, and pounded the fuck out of his hood, asking him why he would even attempt to do this. He just drove away without saying anything. I wasn't thinking clearly and was in a bit of a panic, so I didn't get his plates. They were right there. I'm so pissed at myself for that. The kids were all talking, and I went into protective mode and called the police. They searched the entire neighborhood for the car and put out a description of the guy as well. They put out an alert and were taking this very seriously, so that's that at least. I'm thankful for that $10 whistle I ordered on Amazon. Sometimes you just need to know when the shit is about to go down. I'm still so shaken up about this, and all the kids and parents are super concerned. We have a community website, and we posted about our encounter on there for other parents to be aware as well. I don't know for certain the guy was up to no good, but if he wasn't, why would he just take off running like that? I don't know. My view on safety has been wrecked, and it's going to take a while for things to feel okay again, I think. Make sure your kids have plans for emergencies. They have their own intuitions, and they get gut feelings too that they wouldn't ignore. It amazes me sometimes how reliable they can be.